Welcome everyone. I'd like to thank you for attending this May edition of the Mixed Methods webinar series, brought to you in part by the Mixed Methods International Research Association, as well as the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. Today our speaker will be Dr. Peggy Shannon-Baker, and she'll be speaking on applications of mixed methods research in education. Dr. Peggy Shannon-Baker, lecturer in multicultural education at MMIRA College, is a specialist in the areas of international education, multicultural education, and mixed methods research. Currently, her research focuses on critical approaches to international education, teacher practitioner research, and culture shock. Her scholarly work is interdisciplinary, drawing from critical race theory, feminist theories, and sociology of education. She has published research in Journal of Mixed Methods Research, International Journal of Qualitative Methods, and Journal of Peace Education. So we're very happy to have you here with us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So as Yvette was saying, my name is Peggy Shannon-Baker. Thank you so much for the introduction, and also I would like to say thank you to IIQM and MMIRA for hosting this webinar. I'll give you a little bit of context for the structure. I'll give a kind of presentation, and the link to the PDF of the presentation is available here on this home slide. And you're welcome to follow along on that, or take notes on there or separately, however you like. And I'll be giving a presentation, and then at the end we'll have time for questions and discussion on any of the topics that you all are interested in. So in the chat window, maybe on your lower right-hand side, could people tell us where you're all coming from? I'm curious. Edmonton, Alberta, Mexico, Delaware, UBC, nice. UCLA, Rutgers. Welcome, everyone. Great, New Zealand, Trinidad. Wow, this is really an international webinar. I'm really looking forward to presenting this information to you all. South Africa, welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. So if you're just joining us now, please click on the tiny URL link that's going to pull up a PDF so you can follow along with the presentation. So as you can see, I will have live links throughout. They should be accessible through the PDF. If not, another document for the presentation will be made available later through MMIRA. This presentation, I just want to give you a heads up, is geared toward beginners or novices in mixed methods research. So for those of you, and I do recognize a few names, if you have already some experience in mixed methods, this will be a review. For other folks, some of the things that I talk about you may already know a little bit about, or you might only just kind of have an inkling of things. But I suspect that everyone has a sense, even without formal training, what mixed methods is, so I'm going to try to use some of that. So since the questions will be at the end, if you could please write them down or keep a kind of log of them in your mind as we go along, that would be great. And then at the end, there'll be plenty of time for conversation. So let's move on. So my plan for today is to address some major questions. The major question is, what is mixed methods research, and what does this look like in the context of educational research? So to do that, I want to first start with a frame of what does quantitative and qualitative research look like, because that will then set the tone for our understanding of mixed methods research. Then I'll provide some of my foundational understandings for mixed methods, and then I'll talk about 3 case study examples of good mixed methods research in the field of education, broadly speaking. Then I'll finish with talking about generally the kinds of affordances and challenges to doing mixed methods in education. And then again, we'll end with questions, comments, and concerns. So what is it that we know about quantitative and qualitative research? Take a moment now in your own spaces and think about this question. What do you already know about quantitative and qualitative research? So when I think of quantitative and qualitative research, I go back to my own training in both, and especially these characteristics from Hatch. So whereas quantitative research tends to focus on objectivity, tends to have an a priori design in terms of methods, is very focused on the measurement of variables and understanding relationships between variables. Qualitative research looks at the wholeness and complexity of a problem, is very interested in subjectivity, and might even carry an emergent design. So how is it that we can bring these two seemingly dichotomous approaches to research together into this thing called mixed methods research? And I like to think of mixed methods research as a method, a methodology, a philosophy, and a community. So if we think of quantitative and qualitative work, I also want to throw in arts-based work here, which the people from UBC and elsewhere would hopefully get along well with. There already are some natural overlaps with this. This is not to scale, but for instance, an observation or an interview, you can quantify it. You can have a very closed-ended scale that you would use during observations or things. Similarly, there's a lot of overlap with qualitative and arts-based work. But what I'm especially interested in are these overlaps, and what can we do with these? Are these places where we can do mixed methods work to show how they can speak to one another? Or even on opposite poles, can we bring those two together into a single study? And I would say that we can. So my definition of mixed methods research starts first from a strong philosophical grounding. So I care a lot about orientation and intentionality with research. So you'll see that throughout my presentation and throughout my published work. Ultimately, mixed methods research is when you apply multiple approaches to a single study and you find some way of mixing or integrating them together. And you'll notice that I'm saying here multiple approaches as opposed to both approaches, which tends to favor qual and quan. I would say arts-based research is something else. So I like to use the word multiple approaches to encompass other approaches to research. And I really think that the mixture can happen at any stage. So it could happen at the philosophical stage, data collection, when you're writing it, the analysis, all of these different stages can be where you're mixing in terms of your research. So the main point here in terms of understanding, getting a kind of grounding here in mixed methods research, the main point is this integration or mixing. And I see this as connected to this idea of complementary strengths and weaknesses. This is really important in terms of the history of the development of mixed methods research as a formalized field, that in response to the development of qualitative research, which happened in the 1960s through the 80s, there became this question of, well, now that quantitative research already has a strong foundation and qualitative research is coming in, can these come together? Can they be mixed? And people who originally said they could be mixed together in a single study believed in this idea of the complementary strengths and weaknesses. Now, just to give a brief overview of some of the general styles for design, we have three kind of major categories. So the first is merging, where you would be collecting data simultaneously in different approaches or different strands. So here you'll see I have you're collecting qual, quan, and arts-based research data. Then you would analyze those separately and then bring them together in some capacity. Then there's also another approach called connecting, or it's also called sequential designs, where you'll start with one, and that informs either the sampling or the data collection or analysis of another set of data. Then next we have another category called embedding, where, for example, if you look at the quantitative experiment, if you're really interested in testing an intervention in the classroom, let's say you have a new activity or you have a new lesson plan that you want to do, you're really interested in a kind of quasi-experimental design, you're going to be embedded within that framework, but you might also add in components of qualitative or arts-based in order to supplement what you're doing, but you're still embedded within that. In each of these frames you'll see is partially present or definitively present in the examples that I'll talk about later. And then I'd like to also point out that knowing that the integration is the key point here, the mixing, there are an increasing amount of research coming out about types of integration that you can use in your study. So we have, one of my favorites is data transformation, where you take your quantitative data, for instance, and you would turn it into qualitative data, such as a narrative or a kind of case. I think a lot of researchers are already doing this kind of naturally. You will also see a lot of quantitizing of qualitative or arts-based data. Another common example is using data matrices, where you're actually matching up in a table what your inferences from one set of data say in context with another set of data. So what about mixed methods research in particular to educational research? Some attribute the development of mixed methods to those cultural anthropologists and ethnographers and other people who in the early research stage were interested in triangulation. And we've seen, especially for those who are really interested in instrument fidelity, the use of qualitative interviews to inform either development or the revision of quantitative instruments. And now, as we're becoming more interested in mixed methods research internationally, we're starting to see many more publications, books, presentations, and all of these things that relate back to mixed methods research. So a kind of quick, I know some people might not like this approach, but I always like to just do a quick Google Scholar search, not connected to any VPN, any university system. What could I, as a general person, find in terms of looking for the words mixed methods research and education, educational research and mixed methods, and different permutations of that? So you can see I came up with 4.34 million pieces. Now, the number seems really large, and it is quite large. Some of those would be relevant, some of those would really not be relevant. But I think that it speaks to this growing interest in mixed methods within education. We can see this also in terms of the major grant foundations. Now, I'm coming from the USA, so a lot of these references will be US specific. So in this case, I'm talking about the NIH and the NSF, or even the IES or the Spencer Foundation. All of these are becoming even more interested in supporting or strictly only supporting mixed methods research. We're also seeing graduate coursework. I personally came from a doctoral program based in education that specifically had mixed methods courses. I know some of you are at institutions that may have one mixed methods course, or you may be using a book that I had on the previous slide in an educational research course that maybe touches on mixed methods, maybe doesn't. But this is increasingly growing, especially even faculty lines. Having been on the job market myself recently, the number of faculty lines that are coming up in education looking for mixed methods researchers is growing. And then, of course, on the cusp of this are all of the conferences and all of the conference presentations. There are also many associations that are either have been developed and have been for a long time, or are newly being developed or newly revamped. So A good example is MMIRA, the MMIRA, or the Mixed Methods International Research Association, one of the co-hosts of this webinar. These are links to their association web pages. They are specifically supporting mixed methods, but within any context. The International Journal of Multiple Research Approaches is being newly revamped and restarted with a focus especially on research that uses multiple approaches and mixed methods approaches in particular. So you can see that there's really a growing interest in this phenomenon of doing mixed methods work. So let's talk about this a little bit more concretely in terms of what does this look like in mixed method in educational research. So to start, I just want to mention that when I picked the exemplars to study, I wanted to cover a kind of swath of different subfields within education. Those of you who are familiar with education field in general know there's a lot of different areas that you can go in. So I picked 3 examples, one from educational psychology, one from English language learning, and one from curriculum and instruction. And they're all intentionally 3 different designs so that we could see what kinds of designs are being used and how they're being used, excuse me, in these different contexts. And I also intentionally didn't pick examples from the mixed methods journals because they already put out high quality mixed methods publications, empirical work and theoretical work. But it's important to be able to identify these good examples in other publications, in other journals. So let's check out how I picked each of these. So in the course that I taught on mixed methods at the University of Cincinnati, I looked at, or I taught about these different criterion that we use in order to identify a good quality mixed method study. What is being mixed in the process? When is the mixing occurring? Why is the mixing important? All of these are key questions to ask when you're looking at a mixed method study, or if you're thinking of doing a mixed method study, you should be sure to answer these questions in your development and your implementation. And then a more specific framework is coming from the new text from Plano, Clark, and Ivankova, asking these specific questions. Do they mention the timing? When did they do the quantitative? When did they do the qualitative? Did they discuss the inferences from each, or did they really only kind of focus on one? Can you tell where they were mixing and why they were doing it and how it related back to their research questions? Now, it's important, and this will come out in the analysis that I have of the 3 examples, these special considerations that I've added here. So we're all coming, or we have some interest or connection to education, or maybe we're here because you're interested in mixed methods in general. When these pieces are being published, though, they're within a kind of community that already has some knowledge base, either in your content and or in your methods. So when you're writing a journal article or when you're writing your thesis or dissertation, you have to take into consideration the assumptions of the field. Do they already know about mixed methods research, or would you need to do a little bit of background work in order to provide that foundation for people? And then, you know, the practicality is that sometimes content journals cannot devote as much time to methods as a methods journal can. That's just the nature of how it goes. So word limits are really important when you're critiquing or looking at a piece of an empirical article. If you're deciding if it's a good study or not, look and see if they've published something methodologically leaning somewhere else, because they might answer the questions that you have or the concerns that you have about the design somewhere else where they could manage it in the word count. So let's talk about the first example. The first example comes from educational psychology, and this was published in the Educational Technology and Research Development Journal. They were looking, Hoffman and Nadelson were looking at factors that influence video gaming. So they reached out to students, undergraduates and graduates, who had a high engagement with video gaming and the video gaming kind of community. And they wanted to see what their motivation and goal orientations were and whether or not that could be transferred to the classroom. If you follow video gaming as a pedagogical tool, you'll know that this is a hot question in this subfield. So to answer or address this problem, they used what they call the concurrent triangulation mixed methods design. So here you can see in my notation, they were collecting the quantitative and qualitative data at the same time. Their quantitative data entailed 4 different instruments that they used in both they used a t-test analysis and also regression, a stepwise regression analysis. And then in their qualitative strand, they used interviews, technically from a subset of the people who responded to the instruments, a purposeful subset, and they did 3 phases worth of coding, starting from a priori categories that they had based on their knowledge in the field, and then also based on participants' motivations, and then a general kind of inductive thematic analysis. So in terms of the inferences, this is where they brought everything together. They identified that gaming really satisfied the need to socialize. And because of this strong connection to the socialization aspect, they questioned whether or not games could be used to help people learn the content. What they concluded was that if games were going to be used effectively in the classroom, it has to be directly the content of the game has to be directly connected to the content of the course. And that these notions or feelings for control and challenge were really associated with their engagement. That when they felt that they had a good challenge but could still control the environment enough to win, that increased or had a positive correlation to their engagement or use of video games. So here, this is a good example because they very clearly connect their philosophical orientation. Not many people really like this point. This is something that always sticks out to me when researchers write about this. What's surprising about this example is that they're coming from a positivist perspective, which typically you don't often hear positivists say that they're coming from a positive philosophical perspective. Most often you'll hear it from other perspectives. So it was really interesting to see that come out specifically in this publication. They also, if you're interested, they have a very detailed description of the qualitative coding procedures, more so than most other qualitative articles that I have read. Now, in terms of a mixed methods component, what's interesting is that, as I mentioned earlier, the interviews that they conducted were from a subset of the quantitative participants. Now, in this general design, I'll go back to the previous slide, where you're connecting things simultaneously to compare them later. Your best sampling approach is to draw from the same samples so that you can have more reliable inferences there. But some might say because they were drawing, there was a question on the instrument that asked people to volunteer if they'd be willing to be interviewed in a 20 to 30-minute interview. And they had a number of people who said yes, and they purposefully selected 25. Some people might say, well, this seems to be connected. This seems to be a different kind of mixed method approach. But I felt that they made a strong case for why they conceptualized it as a concurrent example. And also you'll notice that they specifically mentioned the reason or rationale or even design for this was a triangulation. So this is going back to the history of mixed methods. Triangulation is a strong reason for using mixed methods. But in this case, what you see is that they focus on supportive findings between their quantitative data and their qualitative data. They don't spend any time in the article discussing if in fact there were any divergences. Did the two data always support one another? That was a major question that I had that wasn't really addressed in the specific article. Okay, let's move to number 2. So the second exemplar comes from the English language learning subfield of education, and it was published in the Bilingual Research Journal. And here, the researcher is looking to make a comparison to high-stakes test scores and the actual strategies used by emergent bilinguals. In this case, the researcher was based in Texas, and Texas had uses a standardized test to identify where emerging bilinguals or bilingual students are in terms of their literacy, and then some schools use that to help place them in terms of English language courses later. So in this case, they used for 45 students, it was a convenient sample of fourth graders. They collected their standardized test scores. They implemented their own informal reading inventory, another kind of test to measure their literacy. And then for those, they did basic descriptive statistics. They did means and for average scores and standard deviation. Then for their qualitative, they connected this through identifying, based on those standardized test scores, what kinds of activities they should create for the qualitative component. So here, this is what's called a sequential design. So they're really using what came from the quantitative to inform what they did in the second phase. So they identified, based on their standardized test score, what kind of scaffolding activities they would do in a guided reading activity. And then that was embedded within an interview with each of these students, conducted in both English and Spanish, and then also keeping field notes. Then for this phase, they did basic inductive coding and came up with 3 major themes. Then when they talked about their findings, they integrated these 2 together to talk about how the guided reading activities in particular helped to improve comprehension, and in fact, the students were able to demonstrate other knowledges like cultural knowledge or linguistic knowledge that they had, having come from 2 different cultures or having to be in 2 different cultures. Something that the standardized test on its own, if you use that as the sole measurement of literacy, you wouldn't understand, or you wouldn't be able to capture that, because that's not the nature of the standardized test. And so they found that earlier learners required more modeling, passage preview, and rehearsal. Now, in terms of some of my thoughts about this example, what's important to point out, and one of the rationales why educational researchers use mixed methods, is to use, especially if it's a quantitative dominant field, or if your stakeholders tend to be quantitative focused, the qualitative component can help bring the voice of their participants and share their experiences. Or it can also help to answer some of the questions or concerns that the stakeholders might have about some of the research. I'm involved with a project, and they're really interested in using those interviews or focus groups to try to speak to some of the quantitative data that's there. This is a common approach and rationale for using mixed methods. And in this particular design, they also helped by using both their other quantitative instrument and the qualitative measures. They were better able to understand the English literacy development of these students. So they would be able to articulate a much better location or understanding of those students' development, and then be better able to make a decision about where to place those students in terms of English courses later. Now, in terms of some critiques of this piece, the connection between the phases, or how they exactly mixed, wasn't clear. Or at least they didn't devote a lot of time to that particular component. They were really interested in presenting the results of each section and then the meta-inferences at the end. And then also, I'd point out that the quantitative readers or audience members would find that the convenient sampling and sample size in this and the previous one might not be might not make it a very powerful study. Then the third and final example, similar to the educational psychology, this one addresses some educational psych, but I conceptualize it as curriculum and instruction because of the nature of their conclusions that they talk about. Now this one is a little bit older. For the others two, I tried to have it be published within the past, 5 to 7 years. This one was published 11 years ago. But you'll see, because of the arts-based nature, I feel like it's very important to share this study with you all now. So this is coming from the School Science and Mathematics Journal, and these researchers were interested in examining the anxieties that pre-service teachers, so these are college students who are seeking certification to teach. They were interested in their anxieties and emotional reactions to math based on past experience, because they found in other studies and in their literature review that there is a relationship between these anxieties and pre-service teachers deciding to become math teachers, and that these anxieties can even carry on to their future students. So they wanted to investigate this further. They used a pre- and post-test triangulation design embedded within a math methods course. So this is a course where they're learning how to teach math. So they did arts-based and qualitative data collection before the class started and then at the end. And then different to some of the other models, they didn't have quantitative data collection on its own. Instead, they quantified the arts-based and qualitative data, and then added another layer of analysis on top of that. So I'll give you a little bit of details here. The arts-based, they instructed the students to draw math-related experiences and then write out related emotions, and this was all embedded within an interview. Then in terms of the quantitative analysis, they did basic descriptive statistics as well as a 2-proportion z-test to identify if in fact there was a change pre and post intervention, let's say. So they found that there were more positive emotions and less negative emotions depicted, and they attributed this to the conscious reflections on these past experiences with math. And that these conscious reflections through the drawing, through the talking, through the writing, they were able to change their attitudes towards math. Now, anyone here who has experience with mixed methods, or if there were some of the mixed methods key people here, they would say, wait, this isn't mixed methods. It doesn't have separate quantitative data collection. Some other folks, like myself, maybe Jennifer Green, would say that this is mixed methods because they did a lot with their quantitative data, although they didn't collect separate quantitative data. But for the sake of talking about an example with arts-based, I wanted to include this here. I particularly found this interesting because this study has a very strong psychological grounding, especially in terms of their design of their arts-based components. Everything was mapped out and related directly to psychological development, cognitive and affective components of these math complexes that the students had. Also, it's important to point out that the researchers found that the drawings had huge implications for the development of these teachers' self-efficacy in math. And so they make the case for including such activities and such conscious reflection in these types of methods courses, that when you're teaching about how to teach math, it's critical to also reflect back on past math experiences to be able to identify those and work through them in order to have a more positive relationship to math, which can then have further implications for future students. So let me just briefly go over some of the general affordances and challenges to mixed methods research in education. So generally speaking, the affordances, you'll see from some of the key exemplars here, the findings from one data set can speak to another data set. As a mixed methods researcher, I'm especially interested in when these data sets diverge or when they don't support one another, and how does the researcher come up with the rationale for why that's the case. That is really only possible when you're mixing or doing a mixed methods study. In the case with Hoffman and Nadelson, they actually found that their research, through using a mixed methods model, actually refuted commonly held beliefs about the applications of video gaming in classrooms. So through further initiation of similar research studies to that, they would be able to decide if in fact there needs to be a reconsideration of that hypothesis that gaming can positively impact pedagogy and learning in the classroom. And then also you'll find that when a research study does a good job of providing their rationale and or their definition for mixed methods research, they're really setting up why this is the best approach to do it. And some of these tend to be like, you get more justifiable results. They build on the strengths and weaknesses. You can see I'm reflecting back to the history of the development of mixed methods here, that belief in the complementarity thesis, that quantitative and qualitative, or arts-based and quantitative, could support the strengths and weaknesses of one another, or in instrument fidelity, that you want to create the best instrument. In order to do that, you need to collect and analyze it in different modes. Now, this is not without challenges, and I'm sure that many of you will have questions around some of these challenges. I will tell you that there is a huge debate within the mixed methods field about what actually constitutes mixed methods research and what constitutes the mixing, the quote-unquote integration. As I had mentioned with the Rule and Harrell article, whether or not the quantified qualitative data is considered mixing would be up for debate. And there's also this important challenge of considering the audience. That goes back to some of the points I was mentioning earlier, that in some cases you really need to provide more detail, but how can you do that when you have a limited word count and things like that? Another interesting point, and this is something I learned from teaching the mixed methods course I mentioned earlier and working with students coming from nursing, is that more of these agencies are saying, we will fund mixed methods research. And so everyone's like, great, let's all do mixed methods research. But then when this student did a review of mixed methods published research in nursing, she found that, in fact, even though mixed methods was represented in the title or was represented in the abstract, it wasn't clear what was mixed, and maybe it didn't really even seem like mixed methods at all to them. So there's this question of how, even though granting agencies are becoming more interested in this, how can we be sure that people are actually doing what's considered mixed methods research, or at least are they backing up their work with citations in the field? And this goes to the issue of training. Webinars like this, graduate courses, doing your own self-education, these become really important, and you have to have, I believe, you have to have a strong foundation in both quantitative and qualitative or arts-based in order to understand how to bring them together. And really, this all goes back to having supportive mentors. So if you're thinking of doing a dissertation or thesis using mixed methods, you want to ask yourself if your advisors or if the mentors in the field know about mixed methods. Do they support this? That will be really important. And also, because the nature of this work might take longer or might require more resources, you need to be able to have people there to support you. So just a word, as I mentioned earlier, there are live links. In my references, I do have live links to the publications if they are available for free online. I don't have permission to share the other one, so I didn't want to do that, but those live links are available. So here I have my website, my email, and my Twitter. If any of you use Twitter, you're welcome to connect with me after the webinar. If you have any questions or want to talk further, or you need a mentor. And I'll leave it with asking, what questions and quandaries do you have about mixed methods? Please include these on the right-hand side in the chat column.
Thank you very much, Peggy. So if anyone has any questions, you can write them in the side and we'll get those answers for you. I think we had one during your presentation from Rosneil Esvale. What is extreme case analysis?
Yeah, so the extreme case analysis, I believe that was one of the integration strategies. Let me see if I can go back to that slide here so you can see what the citation is there too. So extreme case analyses, this to me is connected to that approach of transforming the data. So in these particular cases where maybe, you know, sometimes with quantitative research, if there's a strong outlier, you might remove it, or you might give some kind of attribution to, oops, sorry, it keeps going. Give some kind of attribution to why there might be an extreme outlier. But in other cases, like say, for example, you're looking at retention of students at a university, and you notice that a certain subgroup of students has a very low retention rate. They're not staying in school, and you want to see why. So in that case, you would be really interested in them. And then from there, you would do this additional work, bringing in maybe the qualitative components, sitting them down in focus groups or interviews, or having them creatively portray their experience and reasons for why they are leaving the school or the institution. So I encourage you to check out the Caracelli and Green citation here to see what further they have to say about that. Thank you for that question. I did notice the one question about whether or not things would be shared. Let me just scoot to the first slide. I have a tiny URL that if you either click on or type into a URL box, you will see a PDF of these presentations. But Yvette will be sharing everything, and it will be available on the IIQM website in a few weeks as well. But everything should be shared soon, I think. Yvette?
Yes, that's correct. It will be up on the IIQM website after the presentation. We have a lot of questions here. The next one's from Nanette for the Hoffman slash, for the Hoffman slash Balogun study, missed what you said about the commonly held beliefs that were refuted.
Oh, yeah. So in that case, the commonly held belief was that classrooms or teachers could capitalize on the kind of excitement and engagement that video gamers have and try to apply that to their classroom by using video games. But what they found was that actually it's not easily transferred, that they had this motivation and high engagement in video games for other reasons than learning.
Okay, thanks. And the next one comes from Heidi Rochelle Brakey. Will you please give a brief explanation of arts-based research?
Absolutely, I would love to. So I conceptualize arts-based research as research that centers artistic practices. And I think of art in a broad sense. So it could be drawing, painting, performative work, spoken word, or other kinds of creative writing. It could be embodied performances and things like that. So in this case, I actually have a journal article that's coming out that I'm writing with a co-author that'll be coming out in the American Behavioral Scientist, where we argue that this kind of work artistic practices can be the use of pre-existing materials. So you might bring in a photo that already exists or a piece of art into an interview to elicit more information. This is called photo elicitation. You might have the participants draw their experiences, like with the example from Rule and Harrell on drawing their experiences or past emotional experiences with math. Or you might draw or create something that is the way of analysis. So you might have the statistics, you might have the qualitative codes, and you want to draw something or create a performance that represents that. Or you might share your work using arts-based materials, an art installation, a performance, a spoken word piece, etc.
And our next question comes from Deborah. What is the difference between mixed and multi-methods?
Oh, this is a great question. I laugh because I was just at the American Educational Research Association, and this was a hot question that came up in a session that was organized by a colleague of mine, Sinem. She had organized a session called Conversation About Mixed Methods, where leaders in the field were talking to graduate students about mixed methods, and one of the questions was, or really around this difference. For me, the key difference is in that integration or that mixed component. So, for example, if you did a survey and you did interviews and you didn't really have them speak to one another, you just kind of shared them in your journal article, that sounds to me more like multiple approaches. But instead, if you created an instrument from the qualitative interviews and then you had qualitative interviews to respond to some of the data in the quantitative survey, that is more of the mixing, because you can see how they're really interwoven again. I'll click back to that contact info slide so that you can get that contact info, Natasha.
Okay, and our next question comes from Rachel. Is there a benefit to quantifying qualitative data within the educational context? I'm not 100% sure I agree that this is mixed method. Is it more efficient, etc.?
Can you repeat the first part of that? I think I missed it.
Sorry. The question is from Rachel. Is there a benefit to quantifying qualitative data within the educational context?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I actually quantified some qualitative data and arts-based data in my own dissertation. I did a study on culture shock. I took students abroad for a number of years, and I looked at their experience of culture shock there. And I did a concurrent study, so I collected a quantitative information about how they were adapting in country. They drew portraits throughout the program, before, during, and after. And then I did field notes throughout and an interview at the end. And I quantified, in that case, excuse me, the arts-based data, or their self-portraits, and I quantified also their qualitative data. And I did this as one of my integration techniques because I wanted to see how these would speak to one another, and I wanted to supplement the quantitative data that I already had. And actually, in my study, I found a number of things that I would not have found had I not quantized that data. So in my particular case, what I found was that there were certain linguistic choices in the students' qualitative data that seemed to potentially, and I'm saying seemed to and potentially because it was a small sample size, so it's not a powerful study, so I can't definitively say there's a relationship. But in a larger study, I would investigate this seeming relationship between words like small and feeling little and this high culture shock. So the students were using these words in their qualitative information, and it seemed to correspond to a high level of culture shock. Now, how would I use that in the educational context? Well, if I can see that some linguistic choices are prevalent with high culture shock, and I'm reading these students' journals as part of the class, I know that this is a point of interface, that I need to interact more with a student. Because even though they might be like outwardly saying they're not experiencing culture shock, or they might quantify that they don't have a lot of culture shock, the qualitative component is really starting to say something else. And so you can use that there to create a kind of intervention moment in that case. I love the quantifying and qualitizing too. I don't find many examples of that, taking the quantitative data and turning it into qualitative, but I think that is one of the most interesting forms of integration.
Okay, our next question comes from Andrea. Do you have advice or lessons learned for mixed method teams where there is different researchers with different methods expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I enter into a research team, and really any kind of team, I recommend this even outside of the mixed methods or research field, is to really start with understanding people's frames of reference. And this really is coming from my strong interest in philosophical grounding. I want to have a sense of what people already believe is the nature of research. You know, things like that. What is considered good research? Sharing, for example, in your team what came from a literature review and identifying key examples. If you can't ask those direct questions or people are having a hard time articulating it, how you present the literature review and good studies you would model your study from would inform you whether or not they would accept things like arts-based research, or even qualitative research, or even quantitative research, if they would accept those as viable methods in your area. So I would, my advice for sure is to start with trying to get a sense of where people's frames are. And then if you can identify some kinds of like roles and expertise, especially emphasizing the expertise, everyone is bringing their own expertise and skills here. And so the question is, how can we operationalize it? When I teach courses in really any subject, I like to tell students, I'm the yes person. Can we do this? Answer is yes. Let's figure out how. And I think that really starts from understanding who we are and understanding that we all have strengths to bring together to this research.
Okay, and I think we have time for just one more question. This one's from Jane Ireland. I do not consider that open-ended questions within a survey collect what I consider is qualitative data, i.e. in-depth data. What is your view?
These are all really great questions, so I laugh because I'm excited to be able to talk about them with you all. The question is, you know, are those open-ended points on a survey qualitative? From a purist sense in the qualitative arm, I would say pure qualitative people would say that's not qualitative. And for that, I would really bring us back to those original set of characteristics. If you have the PDF from the tiny URL, you'll be able to flip faster than me. But the key characteristics for qualitative is wholeness and complexity. And I would question, can an open-ended question, especially because those tend to be few and far between, like there might be 1 to 3 open-ended questions, can those questions really capture complexity and richness, which are key characteristics for qualitative research? I would say if you are collecting that with such questions, you are an amazing survey writer. Otherwise, I would say it's critical to do more traditional qualitative approaches, whether it's observations or interviews or that kind of thing. So I see there are other questions that have come up. I would encourage you all to send me an email, or you can, by going to the link for the PDF that I put here on the first slide. You can comment on my academia.edu page, or my email is pshannonbaker, all one word, @gmail.com. You can send me those questions. I'd love to talk to you further about your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them.
That sounds great. Thank you, Peggy, so much for your excellent talk today, and thank you everyone for attending and for all your great questions. You can join us in June. The date hasn't been finalized yet, but we're going to have Pat Baisley, and she'll be talking about writing up mixed method studies. So before we sign off, Peggy, is there any last words you have?
So I'm going to go back to that. I'm the yes man, I'm the yes person. Can you do mixed methods research? Yes. Find supportive mentors, whether they're at your university or elsewhere. There's a wealth of information out there that can support you in terms of making a strong argument for doing it. You should absolutely do mixed methods research. And please connect with me in the future. I look forward to it. Thank you all.
Perfect. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.